While you're thinking of the continual rubbing of that rough wool against her skin, she suddenly raises her fists and strikes feebly at the air, as if she were doing battle against the images you can make out as you tiptoe closer. Christ, the Virgin, Saint Sebastian, Saint Lucia, the Archangel Michael, and the grinning demons in an old print. The only happy figures in that iconography of sorrow and wrath, happy because they're jabbing their pitchforks into the flesh of the damned, pouring cauldrons of boiling water on them, violating the women, getting drunk, enjoying all the liberties forbidden to the saints. You approach this central image, which is surrounded by the tears of Our Lady of Sorrows, the blood of our crucified Lord, the delight of Lucifer, the anger of the Archangel, the viscera preserved in bottles of alcohol, the silver heart. Señora Consuelo, kneeling, threatens them with her fists, stammering the words you can hear as you move even closer. Come, city of God. Gabriel, sound your trumpet. Ah, how long the world takes to die. Hey, this is Nick.
Hey, this is Eric.
And this is David. Welcome to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast. On this episode, we are reading Carlos Fuentes' Aura, which is a timely gothic tale of cat torture and human puppetry. And, of course, it is a little more than that. There's hints of Poe, there's this claustrophobic gothic story. I'll just throw this over to Nick to start. As a work of genre fiction, this is kind of different from what we're used to reading on the podcast and in the book club. So what'd you think of it? How did you feel about reading it? Initial thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I went into this having read other Fuentes and was pretty surprised at just kind of what you said. It's kind of like a Poe. It's a fun book, and I think we all have opinions as to whether or not that's like okay within literature. But like just to start off, it's written in the second person, which is just super immersive. It actually pushes the storyline. It involves the reader, and I think that's kind of one of the best parts about that. And so, we've kind of already been chatting a little bit about using the second person and the benefits of that. So, Eric, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the second person, it throws you off a little bit, especially for a tale like this. I think second person for me is always, it's trying to envelop you. It's trying to kind of bring you into these bigger ideas maybe, or thrust you into something in a much more, not a Poe-like way. And so I was very fascinated by that once I got into the story and realized what it was about, because I think there is this friction between, and David mentioned this before, between you, the reader, and you, the narrator. And I think that friction is very interesting because the plot itself seems to forecast a lot of things that you can sort of begin to put together before it begins to happen. But at the same time, you're in the position of Felipe, the narrator, too. And so for me, there was this interesting friction here about foreshadowing and at the same time you being cast as Felipe to a certain degree. And that to me was really the most fascinating thing beyond the sort of initial, yeah, this is a fun story. It's, we're reading it around Halloween. It's very
seasonal.
Yeah, seasonal. And as a gothic tale, I think it is really fun and really well done. But I think the second person narration is the crack in it that I kind of was like, why would he do it this way? And what is he trying to get at? And what's the sort of, meta layer here that maybe I'm not understanding initially? And I'm not sure I understand it now. And I think to me that would be a good discussion point to keep going on, because that to me is the hiccup that makes this story interesting.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit on meta layer, and this is my thought as to how this story exists outside of just sort of that fun genre fiction tale, which is in reading other Fuentes, I think he's very much into the idea of recurrence, of kind of eternal life over different life arcs taking more than one actual life to continue. And so this story to me sort of actually reflects another story he wrote. It's in my collection that I have called Burnt Water of his, and it's a tale called In a Flemish Garden. It's basically very similar. It's kind of got a spooky undertone. It has the narrator, albeit written in first person in a diary format. You could also say that's a pretty standard genre fiction thing. But he goes to sort of house sit this house, and eventually there's an older woman out in the garden, and like he becomes further trapped, and eventually he becomes Emperor Maximilian of Mexico, and that the woman becomes Empress Charlotte of Belgium. And so there's a historical component to this thing of he's writing these, a century later, and he keeps playing with this idea of famous historical figures, of generals, of kind of the old day people just stuck in this time loop of sorts. And I think that's the underlying component of Aura that to me is outside of just the fun part of a standard genre fiction tale. That's what I'm kind of curious to get into with you guys, but I don't know, perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself already.
No, I think both of you hit up two of the key things that make me question if this is more than mere entertainment. So the second person and the fact that it's written in the present tense both give it this immediacy, and it's a very easy read. It took me about a night. But the two things that cause some tension in this sort of push-pull between substance and entertainment is the sort of historical leanings that Fuentes seems to have, which are somewhat political, but never very clear, and that friction that Eric mentioned between you, the narrator, and you, the reader. So where you, the reader, you have a better idea of what is happening in the narrative than you, the narrator, Felipe. And I don't know if that's ever really resolved for me. Like, why? What purpose does that serve other than maybe playing with genre?
Well, I think, Nick, you talked, I think at one point about Fuentes has this playful, witty side in some of his other work. I don't know. I think there is him sort of maybe trying to sort of play with this a little bit and make us sort of keep us both light on our feet, but maybe also insert some... I mean, I just think that there's this interesting, where Poe goes at it with such a sincere, darkness. There's no, to me, I haven't read it in a while, but it never struck me as sort of playful. Whereas this story, when I begin to think about it more, despite its sort of dark overtones, is still pretty light on its feet. There were these funny moments. One of the moments that I really liked was, I think it's on page 52, where he asks about the cats, and they go, "Cats? What cats?" And then later talks about this garden, and she's like, "I don't know the garden you're talking about." Right. And it was pretty funny. I just have to say there were these moments that if you thought about it some more, it could almost be sort of slapstick horror, right? It's like, old lady? What old lady? He could have pushed it more. And so I think I appreciate that part of it too, that it seems to be playing on these... I've never read the story, the Dorian Gray story that Oscar Wilde wrote, but I don't know how he sort of, whether it was more serious or more playful. But, if we think about Poe's stories and we think about that Oscar Wilde, Dorian Gray story, and you come to this one, you can see where maybe Fuentes is starting to inserting this little sort of playful, I know what I'm doing here and I want you guys to come along too. There's a lot of questions here, right? I think that when you read a story like this, especially from an author, a celebrated author like this, you're trying to sort of figure out a little bit more, why would he present a story like this?
Yeah, it kind of struck me as self-aware in a way, where he knows the territory he's wading into. And so he is sticking in a little bit of those small jokes and small tiny references. And you kind of mentioned some of the humorous aspects. I think in a lot of ways it's kind of like the first 20 minutes of whatever standard 80s horror movie, right? It's There's the jokes they put in there because they know that they're offsetting the stuff that's going to come.
Yeah, the cat burning, for instance.
Right. That's the biggest joke of
horrific,
them all.
For me anyway. It was just whoa.
But the way it was told was so...
It was so flippant.
It was so flippant. Yeah. That you can't help but laugh. Especially because the narrator, you, kind of just lets it go. What cats? Right. Oh, yeah, I guess maybe not. And then, it's never brought up again. It is And I think you're right, Nick. It's sort of playing with genre where these characters, these accept these bizarre and improbable situations without question. And really his only question is about Aura, who's he's attracted to. Other than that, he doesn't really push much further into the strangeness.
Yeah, the second person kind of gives you that Avatar feeling, right? Where you're involved in all of the decisions, but you absolutely can't do anything other than what's already predestined. And I think that's what you get out of it, which is, I don't know, it's almost like, a choose your own adventure where everything's already picked. And I realize that's boiling this down to something real, lowbrow. But it does have that, and that's what pushes the pages, and that's what allow you to like read this in a simple setting. And you're right, like the cats thing, obviously any of us would probably pay a little bit more attention to some cats burning on the roof somewhere. But like he just moves on. He's like, oh, that just might be a thing that I imagined. And then it's on to the next slightly spooky foreshadowing thing.
Yeah. I came across a quote from Fuentes that I think might be of interest, and he says, "It is not the novel that has died, but the bourgeois form of the novel and its term of reference, realism." And Nick, I know you've read other of his works, and from what I can gather, he does seem to fight against realism in his novels, in his work. So I don't know if they all play with genre, but they certainly, at least based on that quote, I assume, sort of push the boundary of reality in some way.
I think that's definitely a theme. And then also kind of reference one of our book club members, Frida, had kind of tipped us off to a story by Alfonso Reyes called The Supper, of which doesn't really seem to be widely translated in English, but if you search for it a little bit online, you can find an illegal translation. Perhaps it's not. That's not the real correct term, but
bootleg.
A bootleg, right? It's on a cassette tape. But yeah, it's basically a similar tale of a man being invited to a weird dinner party, and as it goes on, you sort of learn that these two women have basically picked him because he is the spitting image of a general, right? And so this story by Fuentes is, to me, essentially a couple decades later playing exactly into that theme of this Reyes story that was written in 1912, and very unapologetically. If you read the two, they're almost identical. And I think Reyes in Mexico and within Latin American literature, from the brief research we've done, is pretty much tied to breaking that realism thing and giving it that element of either magic or just bending it a little bit. And so I think a lot of that is the undercurrent of this.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, too, that you bring up, Nick, is that there is this sort of tradition in Latin American literature of this magic realism, breaking the realism plane. And when we think about it in that context, does this story, is there some additional weight that comes to it when we begin to situate it within this tradition of magic realism, for lack of a better word, in Latin American literature? I mean, I'm not as versed in that, but it's a question that definitely came up to me while I was reading it. I'm not a scholar of much of that literature, but the stuff that I have read, some of the Marquez, the Borges, if you begin to situate it in that context, it's like, oh, there is kind of a continuum here, or at least it seems to fit within that maybe too easy slot that we put a lot of this literature in. And maybe, David, you have some thoughts on that as someone who maybe has read a bit more, or has a bit more knowledge of that history.
I would say off air, Nick, you made reference to Calvino and Borges. In those writers, you have a little more depth, intellectual depth, right? There's more of, let's go to our key word here, there's more substance to their narratives. And I really enjoyed reading the book because it was short and quick, and I was entertained, but I don't know how lasting of an impression it will leave.
I mean, is it a gateway drug for people who maybe are into genre fiction that's a little bit lighter, and Fuentes' Aura is a way for you to like still get some of that, but get a taste of a sort of more higher form of literature, for lack of a better, less snobby word.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel like there's other things that I would recommend personally.
Yeah.
Going either way. So, like, if I know someone that's really into genre that wants a little more depth, a little more, like, challenge in terms of their reading, I think there's other places to go. And for those that are, you know, that don't touch genre, or like you, Eric, you don't really read it anymore, if you grew up reading it, you see the marks as they are. You know what's coming. You kind of see the steps they're taking. I think there's other places you would go for that.
Well, I mean, that's, again, goes back to what you're talking about, like, and what we talked about before is, like, how do you sort of evaluate this? As a genre story, I think it's one of the best written ones that I've read.
Yeah, it's incredibly well written.
Yeah, I mean, it's wonderful in that respect.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to add to my comment about, like, getting vibes of Calvino and Borges. I think it fits in with the rest of Fuentes in that both of those other writers, to me, there's this element of appreciating not only yourself in the activity of reading, but also just the element of a reader. And just this idea that both of them were, you know, extremely intellectual, deeply technical, all that good stuff. But I think they also just really very much appreciated reading as kind of its own separate art form. And to me, when you read other Fuentes and you get really stuck in some deep intellectual, just potentially even off in the weeds stuff sometimes if you're taking a crack at Terra Nostra, which I love, but I also am the guy that reads the long books and then likes it because of the whole Stockholm Syndrome thing, which, to be fair, is also the whole reason this podcast started when David and I were arguing via email over Gaddis, whether or not it was crap. Double tangent. But yeah, I think when I read Aura, to me this is Fuentes just appreciating the aspect that, you know, sort of a fast cracking tale can, like, work really well for a reader. And hey, why don't we try to read this, or why don't we try to write this really well such that it reads really well? And when you fit that within some of the other things he's capable of, I think it is a little bit of a gift in a way. And so that's kind of where those vibes come from for me. Okay,
you turned me. Now that I sit and because when I remember the reading experience, it was pleasure. It was that kind of pleasure that you had when you first started reading. So maybe, Eric, when you read this, you kind of felt like, I've been there, done that, maybe? I don't know.
It's interesting. Before I made those comments earlier this week, I think before the second time I read it. And, you know, I definitely am the kind of reader that tends to privilege more ideas and emotional stakes than I do illusions and formal trickery. You know, I think I brought this up when we talked about Henderson. The reason I liked Bellow so much is because there was always these ideas and emotional stakes that I was very drawn to, and I tend to not be as drawn to books that tend to play with the form or play with all these references that I have to go and look up. I think, to me, it's fine if it builds to something else. And, you know, the books that I mentioned, like Infinite Jest and Mann's Dr. Faustus, that had a lot of illusory and references, but I stuck with them because there was this larger emotional, intellectual stake that I was still invested in. But, you know, I go back to this story, and when I reread it, I have to say that when I got to the end, despite its playful nature, despite its familiarity, those last pages were fairly haunting, I have to say, the way he brought it back to the end. And, you know, that's not an easy thing to do, especially within this kind of Gothic tale genre. And so I think on the second reading, I did appreciate how, hey, I'm being playful, but in the end, I brought it home in a way that, for me, stuck with me the second time, I have to admit.
As we're talking, I'm sort of flipping through passages that I've marked, and it's not entirely playful. He does take time to make these little philosophical questions. And there's one I just found that I'd like to read. You don't look at your watch again, that useless object tediously measuring time in accordance with human vanity. Those little hands marking out the long hours that were invented to disguise the real passage of time. which races with a mortal and insolent swiftness no clock could ever measure. A life, a century, 50 years, you can't imagine those line measurements any longer. You can't hold that bodiless dust within your hands. Now, not only is the writing awesome, but he's sort of playing and questioning the nature of time and our measurement of it. But because it's told in the present tense, and it's such a quick read, you sort of, or at least I did, on my first reading, I moved through that. Like, I appreciate it, but also I was so caught up in just the sort of barrel roll of the narrative experience that I think you need to read this twice to really catch those little things.
Right. I definitely read through that and probably didn't stick. And the second you started reading that, I was like, oh, holy shit, that sort of fits into this idea of, like you said, questioning how time works, how it's measured, how all that comes together. And I think that, to me, was, the underlying theme of the novel itself. And you just sort of picked out a spot that maybe because it read so quickly and so smoothly, I did just speed through, but there is a depth there that, actually deserves some focus.
Yeah, there was another passage I liked too. It was a very brief passage, but I think it's when Felipe is talking to Señora Consuelo about the rabbit, and
another humorous little thing in the book.
Yeah.
I thought. Yeah.
So it's humorous, but then she pivots to this thing. It pivots to this part where he goes, well, the important thing is that you don't feel all alone. And she says, they want us to be alone, Senor Montero, because they tell us that solitude is the only way to achieve saintliness. They forget that in solitude, the temptation is even greater. And I was like, that's an interesting philosophical aside, pivot right after this funny section about Saga the rabbit, right? And I think that's hinting at what you were saying, David, is that there is this kind of light on its feet, playful nature, but then Fuentes will pivot to these philosophical asides that, I actually enjoy and I think do have weight. And I think that's the playful side of this story too, is how it does pivot back and forth between these moments that are very playful and then these moments that carry this weight to them.
Because we miss them, it reveals how effortless he does that. And I think that's worth approbation. I don't know. The more we talk about it, the more I'm appreciating the story, actually.
And I think that's a sign of a good writer, that can sort of slide into these, maybe what seems sort of frivolous on the surface, whether it's genres or types of narratives, and then as we read it more, we begin to see the sort of the deft nature of how they can insert things in there, and upon second readings, discover them. What seems to be kind of a single reading story actually does reveal a lot more upon multiple readings.
And yeah, so that's a really great point, and I think that's a good tie-in to our next episode when we check out one of Fuentes' essays called How I Wrote One of My Books, where one of my books being Aura is the book in question. And so that's going to give us a little bit of an insight into just sort of where he was at, his setting for writing it, his goals, and really just the perception of the author writing himself. So that's kind of an extra layer to the already plentiful layers that we're picking out through this very fun and festive and seasonal tale, but actually pretty rooted in a lot of bigger ideas as we dig into it. So yeah, join us next time on the Books of Some Substance podcast, where we'll be talking about some more Fuentes.
Thanks for listening, everybody. You can find us at Twitter and Instagram at Books of Substance, on Facebook at Books of Substance, and you can check out our website, booksofsomesubstance.com, where we have artwork from our invitations. You can read some of the invitations, look at some of the old books we read, and join the book club if you are interested. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Iconography, 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 iconography.